I'm really pleased to introduce Rabah Amir. I think that it doesn't really need a lot of introduction in this type of conference, but still, I was willing to do lots of jokes, and he told me, be short, no joke. So I will try to be, anyway, so I decided to try to make the connection between Rabat and Marseille, and to do the connection, I think that we have to do a little ride up to Core, because you know that Rabat is one of the leading scholars on oligopoly theory. And in fact, he ended up at Core. I don't know exactly why, if it's because he was interested in that type of questions, or he became interested in that type of question because he was at Core. He might tell us that later. And he's really in the lineage of Jean Gabzevich and Jacques Tisse, and that's where we can have a link with Marseille. Can we really have a link with Marseille? The real link with Marseille is that it's Louis-André Gérard-Varet himself. In fact, he was commuting and coming quite often to Core, and I'm sure that this is how Rabat met him, and that's anyway, it's true that it's a long ride to arrive up to here, because indeed you came to Marseille quite often, and as you visited so many places in the world, we have the feeling that in any department I go, I have the feeling that in any department I go, Rabat is around. So it's so he took position in so many places. I wrote them because it's a bit difficult. So there is, you have Yale, Stony Brook, Core, many other places. I think that I missed Scandinavia, I missed Germany, I missed anyway, right? So this is he's really involved in the travel business, that's for sure. But he's also involved in the economic society. So he's a distinguished member of multiple scientific associations. So there is the Game Theory Association, SAET, Association of Public Economic Theory, and I assume that I'm missing a lot of others, but this is not really important. He's also editors of really important journals, Economic Theory, Games and Economic Behavior, and the Journal of Public Economic Theory. So, co-editor. I think that one. Verna is somewhere here. Yeah, no, not. Anyway, that's the. And anyway, you are also co-editor of many other ones, but I won't mention them. So. I was willing to know exactly how broad these interests were, so I typed on Google Rabah Amir. Then I got a lot of pages where they were talking about him, and there were so many different subjects that I could not even suspect. But I think that for this keynote, you come back to the basic. You're going to talk about Cournot, and if I remember well, it's the second book of Cournot that you're going to talk about, no? Or the second model of Cournot. That's right. So the floor is yours. And I just have to say one thing for the people that are online is that they should write their question on the chat, and I will try, if it's possible, to read them.
Okay. Thanks to everybody for sticking around this late in the event. Thank you, Tanguy, for a warm and wonderful introduction. So indeed, what I'll be talking about, first of all, is joint work with Adriana Gama, who was a PhD student of mine at the University of Iowa and who's now at El Colegio de Mexico. And it is indeed Cournot's second model, which I tested several conferences I've been to lately, including this one. Most people do not know this model. Everybody knows Cournot's first model, quantity competition. Everybody knows it so well that I don't need to introduce this one. That one, but I'll have to introduce very carefully the second one because most people do not know it. So let me introduce it in the simplest and perhaps least ambiguous manner, even though the example will be artificial. Think of a market for gloves, pairs of gloves. People are interested in pairs of gloves, but because of some weird technological reasons, left gloves are produced by one firm and only one firm. So we have a monopoly for left-handed gloves and another monopoly for right-handed gloves. But the demand function, that's relevant for defining the market, is the demand for pairs of gloves, because consumers are only interested in pairs. So the Cournot called the translation into English of what he called this market structure is complementary monopoly, which is somewhat misleading. I guess today we would call it's a duopoly of selling perfect complements. We have two firms selling perfect complements, each of whom sells one of the components of the systemic good, right? So if I say good, it's a little bit ambiguous. So I'll try to say component. For a left glove is a component, a right glove is a component, but the good is really the pair of gloves. And there's only one demand function. Nobody cares about left gloves alone or right gloves alone. Everybody cares about pairs of gloves. So let me quickly jump just to make sure everybody follows me. If I just want to write down the profit function. So this is X and Y are prices. So this is a Cournot model, but it actually has a Bertrand dimension because the decision variables are prices. So the firm that sells the left glove chooses the price of the left glove alone. Same thing for the right glove. And pi I is the profit of firm I. X and Y are the two prices. And if you look at the revenue function, X is my price. X plus Y is the total price for a pair of gloves. That's what determines the demand. And D is the direct demand function, not the inverse demand. So the revenue function looks like the Cournot classical model revenue function, but instead of Q's, we have P's. Instead of quantities, we have prices. And then the cost, this is the cost of firm, function of firm I. It depends on the output of firm I, but the output of firm I is given by the direct demand, which itself again depends on the sum of the prices. So the D is common to both firms. In other words, both firms will sell the same thing in the end because nobody would buy a single glove without buying the pair. So the output or the sales, which is given by the direct demand, is the same for both firms. It's not the price that's common to the two firms, it's the quantity. Let me quickly mention a paper on the topic. So I won't go over the whole literature. It turns out the literature on the subject is more in law and economics than in IO or industrial organization. There are few exceptions, and one is a paper by Sonnenschein, the famous Sonnenschein, where he has a note in JPE where he just observes, it's called Are Cournot's two theories equivalent? And it's somewhat of a superficial look at the problem. He just looks at ignores costs, looks at the revenue function, and says that if you replace quantities by prices, inverse demand by direct demand, then Cournot's two models are equivalent. It turns out once you put the costs in and you look carefully at the properties of the models are substantially different, but they do have this superficial appearance of being similar. So basically, I would say the talk, I'll position it with respect to Sonnenschein's short article in JPE. And I would say that essentially the talk will be focused on giving you the main properties of this new second model and basically making explicit the fact that the two are really quite different from each other. All right, so I go back to the beginning. So I guess the slides are set up to have n firms. So the gloves example is not the best one because we can have n components. But I think in the presentation, I'll try to just talk about duopoly because everything I say about duopoly has a very natural counterpart when we go to oligopoly. So the two goods are perfect complements and they have no substitutes. This is a tacit assumption. Each firm produces one component of the joint good, and the components are useless until used together, unless they are used together. This is, of course, a very somewhat important assumption, and the final price that the consumer pays is the sum of the prices. So in Cournot's book, he was talking about brass. So brass is an alloy that is made out of copper and zinc, where by redefining units, we can just assume that 1 unit of brass is made out of 1 unit of copper, 1 unit of zinc. And these two are perfect complements for the production of brass. So if we look at the demand for brass, then it fits the model very well. It's not the greatest example because copper and zinc are also valuable separately. So his example is not perfect, but he was the pioneer, so we can ignore the problem. So let me talk about some other examples that fit this model, some better than others, but they will probably give you some impression as to why law and economics ended up being the natural home for this model, perhaps more so than IO. So one is segmented roads. So if you have toll roads and a road is commonly owned, or rather different pieces of the road are owned by different entities, then you have this problem where the demand for drivers is just the demand for transit over the entire road. But in that, so there's a very old PhD thesis by somebody named Ellett. It's on the internet, but no one knows anything about this person. So he's almost, he's just 1 year behind Cournot. It's in English, I assume he's probably English. And then Feinberg and Kamian have a version of these segmented toll roads or bridges with two tolls, say like an interstate bridge, and there are two tolls to pay for the bridge. But the most interesting paper is this one. And this is basically, I would say, the history. It actually kind of has an applied theory flavor, but it's really an economic history paper. And they were talking about tolling the Rhine River in the medieval times when Germany was just a collection of several tiny little statelets. And every prince who owns property along the Rhine and owns a piece of the Rhine was allowed by the emperor to actually levy their own toll on their piece of the river. And then it goes on into the history of trade, the emergence of trade in Europe and so on. And they use the fact that, as you can probably imagine intuitively at this point, the more pieces you have, the more inefficient the whole thing is. So I'll show you this a little later formally, but this is kind of obvious. And let me then mention here a famous paper by Spengler in JPE, I think 53, where he talks about double marginalization. And Spengler's model is not exactly, it would be like the Stackelberg versions of Cournot's second model. Too many references here. It's a Stackelberg version because it's the foundation of multi-level oligopoly. But Spengler just talked about multi-level monopoly, where you have an upstream monopolist that sells production input to the downstream monopolist. The downstream monopolist takes the production input and uses it to produce the output, and it's only the output that's sold to the consumers. And then he introduced this terminology of double marginalization, which means basically that the main point of the paper is that the two multi-level monopolies should integrate into a single monopoly, and the consumers would be better off facing a single monopolist controlling both levels of the supply chain, because this is also the foundational model for supply chains, rather than having this double marginalization where the first monopolist extracts a margin when selling the input to the second monopolist. So this is a bit, so the Cournot model could be thought, or rather Cournot was first. So let me just say, Cournot model has simultaneous moves and Spengler's model has sequential moves, but essentially there's a clear connection between the two models. So we can talk about double marginalization in the Cournot model or multiple marginalization, because the Cournot model, by virtue of the fact that you can have n firms in a single period, it doesn't complexify the model to have n firms. Whereas in Spengler, the model would completely change if you had n levels, with a game over time. All right, so that's this paper. But by the way, their conclusion is that the emergence of England as the center of trade in Western Europe owes a lot to this problem of how Germany was not a nation state, and you had multiple tolls on the key river that was a key piece of basically of shipping for trade in Western Europe. Then another very interesting application that is, it's not an obvious one, is on corruption. This is based on a paper by Schleifer and Vishny. This is QJE 1993, quite late in the game. This paper is super original because it doesn't have a single symbol No Greek symbol, no Latin symbol. It was just words. And 1993. For people who think QJE is a place where connections matter, that might be one example to give. So what do they talk about? They talk about corruption. It's actually called, the subtitle of the paper is The Industrial Organization of Corruption. And they talk about two main ideas. One is you can hope to cure corruption by introducing, say if you're worried about corruption in a passport office for a country, you may have several independent offices, and that would drive down the bribes. If the passport administrator collects bribes to give you a passport, then by having multiple offices and allowing people to go to whichever office they wanted to apply for a passport, then you would at least, if not get rid of corruption, it would lower the bribes to level that people can manage to pay them. But then they also talk about this model. So that would be, I guess, the Bertrand approach to corruption, this first idea. But the second idea that's more related to my talk is that in some corrupt societies, you see a proliferation of different offices that people need. For instance, if you want to open a restaurant, open a business, a bar or something like that, you need more and more layers of bureaucracy. You need to get a permit from multiple offices. And then if you think of the demand for having restaurants as your basic market, then you have to satisfy n different offices, each of whom is probably corrupt, and that fits the model quite well. So that's the second part of this paper. Again, they do it without any equations, but they refer to the model and they just assume that people know the model, which is not an obvious assumption. Then another application, this is more industrial organization, is in patents, patent pools. So there's some technologies for which in order to license or to become a licensee of the technology that a firm needs, you need to obtain licenses from a number of separate rights holders, because it so happens that different components of what you need, technology that you need, are controlled by different firms. So you need to satisfy all of them in order to become a licensee of the set of patents. Connected to this would be also things like land ownership. When somebody wants to buy a piece of land or some sort of good that's owned by multiple owners. So typical thing would be land again. If you have a rich family with lots of brothers and sisters who live in different places in the country and they jointly own the parents' estate, then again, you have to sort of buy them all out separately. Kind of fits this model if you think that the siblings are behaving in non-cooperative ways from each other. By the way, the equilibrium notion is, of course, Nash equilibrium, pure strategies. So that part is the same between the two Cournot models. All right, any questions on the framework itself then? So here's what we do in the talk. So I'm going to talk about existence very briefly. And the reason why it's good to always, it's one of the foundational questions for any model. It turns out there's nothing in the literature about existence. And it's one of the areas where the results are strikingly different from the usual Cournot model. And that's very easy. That's actually something we understood quite late. And if you pay attention to the slides, I'm using slides that were barely modified from a previous version of the paper where we didn't understand the existence question completely. So it looks trivial ex post, but it wasn't ex ante. Oh yeah, so I talked about, so then the other perspective we take is again to answer the question of Sonnenschein. So the title of his paper is, are Cournot's two theories equivalent? And we'll answer that they're largely not equivalent. All right. So here's the model. And we start with the asymmetric model, but a key part of the presentation will be to convince you that the model is intrinsically symmetric. And that's, again, the part that's not trivial. It looks trivial once you know the answer, but it was not trivial ex ante. So again, this is the profit function. X and Y are the prices. Whether we have two firms or not doesn't matter, because just like the regular Cournot model, if we have n firms, this is the firm I is the one that charges price X, and Y would be the sum of all the other prices, all the other firms' prices. Yeah, so there's technical assumptions. We don't need differentiability, but it simplifies the presentation. So we make the assumption. So let me look at, for this part of the presentation, I will look at linear cost. So there's constant marginal cost CI for firm I times D. D is the direct demand or the output or the sales. Probably the best way to think of D is the sales, which depends on P1 plus P2. X1 plus Y, the sum of the prices. So then in this case, the profit function reduces, in case of linear cost, this is the profit function. And if you just take this profit function and you make the following change of variable, instead of letting firms choose their own price, let them choose their markup. So markup, as usual, is defined as the difference between price and marginal cost. So that's markup. So this is the profit per unit sold. That's what the markup is. And if you write the profit function with markups, then you, instead of X minus CI, you write MI. That's firm I's markup. Then D of the sum across all firms of the markups plus the costs. So that's just plugging in for each X, M plus C. So you add up all the M plus C's. But then if you look at it this way, this is a symmetric game. The CIs could all be drastically different. You reduce it to a symmetric game. This is a symmetric game. So yeah, in the case of two firms, you would write this way, where you have firm I and firm minus I, and the sum of the costs appears together here. So that means the game is intrinsically a symmetric game. And if I'm given a game where, say, duopoly version, where C1 and C2 are very different, I form C1 plus C2, and then it doesn't matter how I reallocate C1 plus C2 across the two firms, it's the same game. So I may as well make my life simple and redefine the game as one in which each firm has half of the total unit cost, and then just analyze the symmetric game. And that means, for instance, later in the talk, I'll talk about the effects of entry, and I'll define what entry means in this problem. It's not that obvious in terms of the economics of it, what it actually means. And then we can just look at the symmetric case, because for any game that you might give me, that game is equivalent to its symmetric version that I just defined. And so we reduce the analysis to symmetric game, and this has dramatic implications, also for existence and a bunch of other things. All right, so now, if I make another, I'm going to talk about the existence question in 2 minutes. I don't want to make it too technical, but I need to make another change of variable where for firm I, instead of letting it choose its own markup MI, I'm going to let it choose the total markup once firm minus I has chosen its markup M minus I. So then I rewrite the profit of firm I as some function pi I tilde as a function of the other firm's markup and the sum of the markups. So just make this substitution here, you get to this rewriting of the profit function. And if you look at this profit function and you now take the cross partial derivative of pi I tilde with respect to Si and M minus I, here it is. It's actually equal, this cross partial derivative is equal to minus D prime, but D is a downward sloping demand function, so this is positive. And that means pi I tilde is supermodular in Si M minus I, which let me just skip to the implication of this assumption. Because we have this cross partial being positive everywhere, if the other firms increases its markup, I might respond by increasing or decreasing my markup, but the sum of the markups will increase. So the other firm increases its markup, the sum of the markups will increase as a direct consequence of this fact. And that alone gives us existence, just this property. So that basically means that if I look at the mapping that takes the markup of the other firm into my markup, it has slopes bigger than -1 everywhere, right? Because the sum goes up. So if the sum goes up, if Mi plus M minus I goes up, when M minus I goes up, it means that Mi, the reaction curve Mi as a function of M minus I, has everywhere slopes bigger than -1. And that's enough to get a fixed point. So this is actually insights from the regular Cournot model, but they translate to this model directly. But interestingly, This means that existence is there. We don't need anything. We just need the reaction correspondences. There are no assumptions. You get existence anytime. The only thing you need is the reaction curves to be defined. So you need either the primitives, the demand and the cost functions to be continuous or even semi-continuous. So this is the only oligopoly model I know of where existence is guaranteed without assumptions. You don't need any concavity, quasi-concavity, nothing. And this is very different from Cournot. In Cournot, there are known counterexamples that if you don't put some sort of limit, some sort of conditions on the inverse demand, at least, you will not get necessarily guaranteed existence of pure strategy Cournot equilibrium. So this is a symmetric game. And out of this slope property, the fact that my reaction to the other guy's markup has slopes everywhere bigger than -1. This not only guarantees existence through a fixed point that's kind of known in this literature, but it also guarantees that there is no asymmetric equilibrium. And this ties in with the remark that I said earlier, we can always be analyzing the symmetric game. So the equilibrium will always be symmetric when the variable of choice is the markup. So at equilibrium, it doesn't matter what the actual unit costs of the firm are, they will both charge the same markup. And there's no asymmetric equilibrium. There cannot be an asymmetric equilibrium. Again, no assumptions, it's just all there. So the firms could be charging different prices if they have different costs, but they will change the same markup. But that also means that if my rival's cost goes up, in any oligopoly model, when my rival's cost goes up, it's good for me, and vice versa. But here, if the rival's cost goes up, it's bad for me. That's a direct implication of this. Again, if you look, perhaps the best place to see it is to look here, here. The total cost appears here, and it affects the symmetric version of the game in a very clear way. Higher cost means higher prices, and so it's bad for both of us. But when I say higher cost, it doesn't matter whether it's my cost that goes up or the rival, it hurts us equally. So in this sense, this is a game of partnership in some sense. We're both interested in having lower costs, not as some sort of bargain or some sort of agreement, or it's actually, so for instance, if the goods are somewhat related in their production processes and I make some process R&D that lowers the cost of my version of the product, my component, then I have an incentive to literally give it for free, license it for free to the rival to help them lower their costs. It's directly good for me. I don't even have to charge them. I can also charge them, but you know, it's a good idea to do it even if I don't charge them anything. So these are very different properties of the model compared to the regular Cournot model, but also compared to any other model. How much time do I have?
That's my role. 23 minutes, so you still have 20 minutes.
Okay. All right. So I guess I will not go into the details of it, but obviously this idea that you have costs that impact that they have the two costs that impact the firms equally, irrespective of whose cost goes up and so on. It has all sorts of other implications. I guess licensing would be the most obvious one, but there are other implications. But I think I'll skip that so I can get to some of the other insights from the model. So at this point, let me introduce another paper from Law and Economics. It's in the Journal of Law Economics Organization. It's by Buchanan, the Nobel Prize, and I think a student of his. And in that paper, they talk about the parking that's jointly owned by the city and a private entity. And again, the demand for parking would be the actual good that defines the duopoly. And we have the city charging a price, the private owner charging a price, and people have to pay the total price. And they have an analysis where they have a similar conclusion to Sonnenschein. They say essentially they call it the tragedy of the anticommons. So this is like a model of anticommons. Most of the examples I gave fit that description, and they talk about the inefficiency of having multiple marginalization And yeah, they introduced this terminology of anticommons, and they with the tragedy going with it. And at the same time, they ignore costs because the parking is there. So you don't have any production cost. It's just an asset that's sitting there. You own it already. So costs were naturally ignored in their model. But if you bring in costs, just like with Sonnenschein's insight, a lot of the things they discuss break down. So their insight, where essentially they have some sort of direct duality between the Cournot model, Cournot's first model and Cournot's second model, breaks down when you introduce costs. I'll give you the expressions later on, but I just wanted to mention that's the other paper we relate to a lot. So I guess I already went through this. Yeah, so now the question we ask, second question, is what happens when the number of firms, goods in the market increases? So if we increase competition, but this is not really the meaning of the question, right? So when I write this, most people would naturally think competition is increasing. This is not exactly a model of competition. As I said, it's a model partly of competition, partly of partnership. So first I have to say what it means, what it would mean for any of the context I gave to have the number of firms increasing. So for instance, in Cournot's example of brass as an alloy made of zinc and copper, it doesn't make any sense because the technology uses those two goods and you simply cannot complexify the technology and introduce one more metal into the mix. It could potentially make sense if maybe to produce a better brass, you could bring in steel or something else in the mix, but a priori that need not be the case. But in some other context, this question could be very meaningful. For instance, if you say tolling the Rhine, then obviously the number of entities that made up the German, the German Holy Empire, the old Germany with all these different entities, the number of entities kept changing over time because you had people princes buying each other out, or a prince dying and his brother or his sister taking over his realm, etc. So the number of poles was changing over time. So that would be a context in which this makes sense. In the Schleifer and Vishny paper, where you have corruption, they talk about corruption in some emerging economies like Russia and so on. And that in these corrupt societies, you see typically the number of layers of bureaucracy increase, thereby giving rise to this model. That definitely fits the question very well, because that's indeed what they were talking about. There's an endogenous increase in the number of layers because different parts of the government are corrupt, and so you naturally have the number of components increase, which are the different offices that a restaurant owner has to satisfy before opening his business. So what is the effect? So then the question makes sense. Not only that, but it makes sense to look at the question only in the symmetric context because of what I said earlier. For any asymmetric version of the model, it's actually equivalent to its symmetrical version. So we can just restrict attention to the symmetric version, and we're actually analyzing the general case. So this it would be like doing comparative statics of Cournot equilibria, Nash equilibria as n changes. There's a single parameter that changes, but it actually would mean literally having firms enter, irrespective of whether they have the same costs as the existing firms or not. So the effect of increasing the number of firms. No, sorry, I actually need to go back. I forgot something. I didn't talk about the, sorry, I have my slides mixed up as I warned some of you, and I lost. So I didn't give you conditions under which this model has strategic complements or strategic substitutes. Let me do that first. No, so sorry, the two questions are mixed up in these slides. That's why I'm confused. Okay, so let me just go back. The questions of whether we have strategic substitutes or complements is embedded in the question of looking at the effects of increasing the number of firms. Okay, now I got it. All right, so we're back to this question, and I'll talk about whether, so let me verbally introduce the problem first. So for those of you who know the literature on Cournot oligopoly, you get existence in regular Cournot oligopoly when you have continuous reaction curves. So that's the equivalent of using Brouwer's fixed point theorem or Kakutani, or the other approach that was introduced by Novshek in the 80s, and then I wrote several papers myself, is when you get existence because the game is a game of strategic substitutes. So a game is of strategic substitutes if the reaction curves, so the mapping from y to x in this model, or from m minus I to mi, that's the usual reaction curve. If the reaction curve has downward sloping, as correspondences, there are no concavity assumptions anywhere in the model a priori. So the reaction curves are not functions, because everything is very general here. They are set valued functions, but strategic substitutes just means that as a correspondence, it's going down. The reaction curve as a multi-valued function is going down in the sense, for instance, of having selections that are decreasing functions. So that's enough to give you existence in Cournot. And in the regular Cournot model, most people believe that the Cournot model is naturally a model of strategic substitutes. And there's a lot to that belief, because indeed, if you take the inverse demand being a log concave function, meaning the log of P is the inverse demand as a function of total output, is if the log of P is concave, that's what a log concave function is, then, which is a very general condition. So it means all the concave functions work, linear demand works, and even mildly convex inverse demands work, the limiting case being the exponential declining demand, like e to the minus q. If you have the inverse demand e to the minus q, you take the log of it. Log of e to the minus q is just minus q, and that's linear, so that's the limiting case of log concavity. So people's belief that the Cournot model should be one of strategic substitutes is indeed verified, because the set of inverse demand that gives you that property is very broad. Now, in the Cournot model, the regular one, if you ask the question, when is the Cournot model a game of strategic complements, meaning the reaction correspondences are upward sloping, then it turns out, this is in some of my old work, that you cannot have it. As long as you have production costs that are not zero, you cannot have the Cournot model being a game of strategic complements. It's impossible. And we're going to see that the second model of Cournot is different in that respect. You can have strategic complements, or you can have strategic substitutes. It is actually the more natural case, again, for the second model, is strategic substitutes, just like for the first model. So this is something they have in common. But when you ask the question of the possibility of strategic complements, again, in Cournot's first model, it's not possible as long as you have costs. In this model, it's very possible, but the assumptions you need to get strategic complements are very restrictive. So I'll be going through them as I answer the question of what happens what happens when you increase the number of components, or n. So the first result says that equilibrium, so this is the equilibrium total price. Again, that's what matters to consumers. As you increase the number of firms, this is always, total price will go up. So that immediately tells you that consumer surplus is hurt when you increase components. So the merchants who want to use the Rhine for shipping are hurt when the number of princes in Germany increases. And the equilibrium per firm profit is also decreasing in n. So the more components you have, the less profit each prince gets. Equilibrium output is also decreasing in n, but I'll ignore this fact. I won't stress it here. So here's the results where the things depend on whether we have strategic substitutes or complements. So this is the normal case. I would say this is the natural case for the second model of Cournot. So again, it's a strategic substitute. So what are the conditions for that? Just like for the Cournot's first model, we need the direct demand, not the inverse demand, to be log concave. So that's very analogous to the Cournot's first model, and the cost function to be convex, including linear. And then the game is strategic substitutes, and we have a unique equilibrium. In Cournot, you wouldn't get a unique equilibrium from these assumptions, but here you do. And the equilibrium per firm price, so the price charged by every firm, is decreasing in the number of firms. So these would be the natural conditions. If we want the opposite, again, the case of strategic complement, it's possible, but then the sufficient conditions, the minimally sufficient conditions become somewhat restrictive because you need a direct demand that's log convex. So log is a very concavifying transformation. So if you require a decreasing function to be log convex, it's very restrictive. The only set of commonly known direct demand functions that are log convex are the hyperbolic demands, like 1 over q to the alpha and so on. And you need concave costs, which is possible, but somewhat uncommon. In other words, you're increasing returns in production, which is somewhat common. Then the game is strategic complements, and the comparative statics on price is reversed. So actually, the more components you have, the higher each firm charges. So this has somewhat unusual comparative statics properties on the equilibrium price per component, and yet this is very robust. And there's absolutely no version of this result for the Cournot's first model. Okay, now what about, so now we go in the direction of studying Spengler's negative double marginalization results, but for consumers and social welfare. So first of all, consumer surplus, as I said, is always decreasing in the number of firms. So it, you know, when there are more tolls on the Rhine, that's always bad for people in the shipping business. Then equilibrium total profit is also always decreasing in N. So this is similar to the Cournot model or other oligopoly models. So in other words, in some sense, you can see it as increasing the number of firms is partly increasing competition because it's bad for industry profits. And because both consumer surplus and producer surplus are decreasing in the number of firms, of course, social welfare is decreasing in the number of components. So this is the version of Spengler's double marginalization result that holds in the one-shot version of a supply chain. You can think of it that way. Then what about the price cost margin? So the price cost margin is again the difference between price and marginal cost, even when the marginal cost is not constant. This is a general result. So it could actually, more competition or more components could make it decrease. This is in the usual case where demand is log concave, but it could be going the other way. So competition could increase markups if the demand has the restrictive property of log convexity. So that's the definition of markup. It's just price minus marginal cost. Okay, now let's compare. So the question that Spengler talks about in his sequential version of this game is basically, would it be advantageous to break down the supply chain by just integrating the two levels into a single monopolist? And that's the question we ask here. So if we take Cournot's example and say, well, the same firm owns the copper and the zinc, would it be, what would be the implication? If we have a single monopolist instead of Cournot's oligopoly with perfect complements, and the answer is the same as for Spengler's paper. So if we compare the N-firm oligopoly with perfect complements, or then it's the monopoly version, the integrated version, where you have a single firm producing all the components, but then of course it's a multi-product monopoly because the technology is the same, so there are multiple components still. So the multi-product monopolies has higher total profits. So it's good for industry for this to happen. Lower total price, higher consumer surplus, same thing. So it's good for consumers and therefore it's good for social welfare. So this is literally it doesn't need any assumptions. And again, because existence is guaranteed even without assumptions. And we have a very general version of Spengler's result, holding without any assumptions. How much time do I have? I'm already past? No.
Still 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. So I think what's left then is just to talk about Buchanan and Yoon's paper, this tragedy of the anticommons. But I guess I'll probably will mostly skip it because there's not much else I have to. So that's the paper I mentioned with the two parkings and so on. So in that paper, they actually consider linear demand. And here we reconsider the example and we added costs because they consider zero cost. And so we compared all the different variables that constitute an equilibrium here for so we consider the model with costs. And just to have Buchanan's result, just let C be 0 here. And when you let C be 0, there's a nice mirror image of the Cournot's second model with Cournot's first model. But as soon as you put costs, the expressions are all actually, most of them are actually different. So when you put costs, this perceived duality, both by Sonnenschein and by Buchanan, actually completely breaks down. And this happens even if you have a very simple example like linear demand and linear cost. So, and then they just repeat all the results that I gave you very generally for this specific case, and they call the situation where you have multiple ownership a tragedy of the anticommons. So the conclusions then are that if production is costless, then Cournot oligopoly and oligopoly with perfect complements, Cournot's two models are mathematically equivalent theories, but as soon as you have costly production, the duality breaks down completely, both in terms of what guarantees existence of equilibrium, the comparative statics of an entry, and the fact that multi-product monopoly is preferred by both consumers and firms over oligopoly with perfect complements. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions. Yeah, go ahead. Mathis. Sorry.
So my question may be irrelevant, but do you think that in this kind of model, there is more incentives for firms to form agreements on prices or cartel in compared to the classical oligopoly Cournot model?
Yes, there's definitely an incentive to literally merge.
Okay.
So if they cannot merge, so in other words, the merger policy regarding these oligopolies should be completely different from regular mergers, because basically competition is destructive here. I didn't use this word, but this is really a classical example of destructive competition. If by having more firms as being synonymous with more consumption is taken as really meaning having more consumption. Again, I argue that it's not exactly true, but for sure, reducing the number of components is good. So allowing a bunch of firms to merge is good, and allowing all of them to merge to a single monopoly is good. So the implications for antitrust are very clear.
So it's a pretty technical and subsidiary question, but your very first existence theorem, you said it would go through just under supermodularity, that you didn't need any further assumption. It was very an example of a rare example of existence without many conditions, but still you had supermodularity. And you started with a discrete example with the gloves. So maybe for copper and zinc, you can have any kind of quantities, but in some examples, you may expect discrete quantities. So my question is, does the existence result you started with go through with discrete quantities, which would be very surprising, but could still preserve the supermodularity, I believe?
Very good question. We haven't thought about discrete prices here.
Yes, you did, because you started with the gloves.
No, but the gloves is just, I mean, the set of components is always discrete.
No, the quantities are.
Oh, I see. Okay. But that's the usual. I mean, all units of the goods are discrete, but we cheat a little bit in oligopoly and we look at continuous. So that's okay. But still, the question is interesting. So, okay, first let me correct, perhaps your perception might be slight. Supermodularity is not an assumption, it's always there. So once you go to the symmetric.
That's what I would think, it's still there when you have discrete quantities.
Is it
That's
still
exactly
there?
what I had in mind.
Yeah, you're right, supermodularity would still be there, but I'm not sure that the fixed point theorem that I mentioned has a discrete version. And a priori.
That's exactly the point.
Yeah, okay, all right. So now I understand your question, but it might actually. So let me think a little bit about it. And let me guess with some risk and answer that the discrete version would work. And the reason is so the fixed point theorem I mentioned is if you have a correspondence from a compact interval to itself, and if you take you have the graph of the correspondence, you take any 2 points on the graph, the slope, you take the line segment joining the 2 points, the slope of the line segment is larger than -1. That gives you a fixed point. But now if it's a discrete set, don't look at this version of the fixed point because I don't see how to make this work with, but you can use Tarski's fixed point theorem and say you map the markup of the other firm to the total markup divided by 2. And this is an increasing map. So the map, so if M2 to M1, the 2 markups, M2 to M1 has slopes larger than -1, then M2 to M1 plus M2 divided by 2, the average of the 2, is increasing. And then Tarski's fixed point theorem is valid for discrete functions. So I think the answer is yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there is a question there, and then.
Another natural way to increase the number of firms would be to have, say, N copper producers and M zinc producers. This would also unify the 2 models by having competition for the raw product.
That's right. So very good question. So we found one paper after we did this one that kind of looks at that, but for some reason, which is a very natural way to merge the product. So if you missed Eddie's question, then he's saying you can have several firms selling copper, several firms selling zinc, and then it's a natural way to merge Cournot's 2 models because you have competition for the supply of one component, competition for the supply of the other component, but then you have Cournot's second model when you put the 2 sides together. Yeah, then it turns out you get a convex combination of the properties. So it just depends on how far, for instance, if you look at the effects of increasing competition, so you would be increasing competition in each component, and then you would be increasing at the same time the number of components. It just depends on how fast the 2 processes are increasing. But yeah, that's a very natural question. And there should be more work on that.
Could you tell us whether some of your results depend on the linear cost assumption? So it was very clear your proof of the symmetry, and it was not so clear how it would extend to
good question. So I didn't mention anything about it. I used the linear case because you can show it in 30 seconds, but the proof in the other case is much more complicated. So, but the result works. And by the way, I should add that in Cournot's book, Cournot did not worry about existence at all, which is a little paradoxical because he was a mathematician. But when you think that he was writing in 1838, no fixed point, as far as I know, was known. So Brouwer's fixed point theorem is, I think, 1911 or 1912. So he just never, there's no evidence that he thought that Cournot equilibrium might not exist. There was no evidence, at least in the book. I don't know if other people who know more about the history of economic thought have an answer, but when I looked at the book, the question about existence is not mentioned at all, which probably presumes that Cournot thought existence was guaranteed. So now I lost the train of my thoughts. So I mentioned existence because, yes, right, okay. So the fact that with linear costs, you have equal margins at equilibrium is in Cournot's book. Of all the advanced results I mentioned, it's only that one. And he also saw that having the same price cost margins when costs are linear, so when every firm has the same price cost margins, even though they have different unit costs, also implies they have the same profit. So that's how far as he went. So the rest is things we added. There's only, by the way, this chapter, I think the book is like 10 chapters. There's only one chapter on the second model. Everything else is on the first model. So, yeah, Nicolas. No, the fact that the price cost margins are equal at equilibrium is very general. Yeah. It does hold. Yeah, it does hold. So if you write the first order conditions, you see it immediately. That's how Cournot saw it. You just write the first order conditions and you see it.
We have a last question on the back.
I just have a somewhat confused question maybe about the analogies between the two Cournot models and tragedy of the commons models. So normal Cournot, if we can call it that, is analogous to the average return game and tragedy of the commons. They're both surplus sharing games, but there's kind of a switch with normal Cournot for social welfare. We want more competition,
right?
Yeah, bigger N.
Yeah.
But for the resource sharing game, we want smaller N to preserve the resource rents.
Right.
Now, if I understand you right, this second Cournot is analogous to the anti-commons game,
yes,
in a similar way, but
right,
yet in both cases, competition is still, large N is bad. Is that right? We don't have
in both cases being
Cournot 2 and anti-commons.
Well, Cournot 2 in the eyes of Buchanan is a model of anti-commons. For he sort of coined this idea of tragedy of the anti-commons as being just a reflection of this idea that competition is bad or common ownership is bad in the second model. Yeah, so it's actually in his mind the same thing. Maybe there are other definitions of anti-commons, but in his mind he's just using anti-commons to really capture this idea that competition is not a good thing in the second model.
So it's not right to say that Cournot 1 is to regular tragedy of the commons as Cournot 2.
No. That's right. Yeah, thanks. Susanna?
Yes, no, I just have a question, which is what I guess empirical implication of this, because when yes, there's a tendency in this market, profit increases, and moreover, from the cycle viewpoint is good. So I wonder what are the barriers out there for these things still to exist?
Maybe your question is the answer as to why the model received more attention in law and economics and in sort of public economics with corruption and so on, rather than in industrial organization. So yes, the tendency is for integration, but there may be institutional reasons and other reasons as to why that wouldn't take place. Certainly, it wouldn't be necessarily antitrust. But if you take tolling the Rhine and so on, I mean, the life of Germany was made miserable by having all these different entities, statelets. It took them centuries to merge. So, and we know how bad that was for Europe. So for France, other places. So yeah, they're historical forces, let's call them.
Thank you very much.